Hey, folks, welcome into the Takeup. I'm glad to have you here for episode 222, where we're going to talk about low stitch count embroidery. Now, I know this is something that we've covered many times on this show before, and frankly, it's something we'll probably cover again. The thing is, I think that there are some useful things we can take out of this. We'll make this a short show. Hopefully, we'll see how that goes. It doesn't always go that way, but we'll talk about some of the things that we can do with our embroidery to remove excess stitching. Certainly, what we can do design wise, and talk about some of the stories I have as far as what I had to do to make designs work in less stitch count, to make them work while maintaining efficiency. And we'll try and do kind of a multi-pronged approach here. So we'll talk both about things that we do design wise and as far as selecting the way we want to use thread to make marks in order to use fewer stitches and get more impact out of them. But we'll also do a little bit of discussion briefly about what we do if we are stuck with a fairly standard commercial logo type execution, and how we're going to handle what we need to do as far as reducing stitch counts without doing things that expose more of background materials, without replacing materials or using applied materials, without necessarily delving deep into altering the design matter itself. So we're going to do a little bit of both here today. We'll talk about both. We'll discuss what the differences are. We'll talk about what we can do and can't do to remove stitch count, and when stitch count and applied materials kind of come together to either reduce overall work or sometimes just be a wash and be easier for execution, or maybe just provide a look that is not attainable in any other way. So in this case, we've got kind of multiple things that we're trying to do here. We're talking about both being efficient, but also being creative. And I think all of these things can kind of come together. You'll have seen some of these samples before. Some of these maybe you will have not. But I think it's worth kind of discussing the types of stitches we're looking at, the types of techniques we're looking at, and what it means to be stitch conscious. Right. So stitch consciousness for me is using every stitch that I need, but no stitches that I don't. It's something I try to do kind of in all of my embroidery, no matter what the style is. But if we think about that and then expand out into the more creative side of embroidery, what can we do specifically to make things look the way that we'd like them to look, or to have an interesting textural look, knowing what thread does and using thread to its best end? We can have that discussion where we say, is full coverage, full complete coverage of the background really the only way that embroidery can look good? Is it really the only way that we can make something that's interesting, or that fulfills the need for a customer in a particular way? So we'll talk about that. Probably some samples you've seen before. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to make new samples. You guys know, if you've been around the show for a while, you know that I am smack in the middle of preparing for a massive, complete cross country move somewhere that is 27 hours away from my complete location right now, and that is 27 hours away, driving full tilt every single minute of every single hour. So you guys may wonder what I'm doing even being on here today. And sometimes I wonder myself, but I can't leave you alone, and I can't leave you with no content for the week. So we're going to go ahead and talk about this. And this comes out of some questions that I got over some previous pieces I had shown. And in relation to some pieces that I'm seeing floating around out there. We all know that people have been really doing a lot of awesome experimentation based on reading Bonnie Nielsen's book that has come back into the limelight recently. And some of her pieces are done with very low stitch counts, showing through a lot of the background materials and applied materials. And all told, this is, I think, something that can really drive a renaissance of new techniques, new textures that we can access through embroidery. And I think that hopefully, if we talk a little bit about it and give you some tools to work with, and if we're lucky, a little bit of confidence to work with these tools, anybody here can make some really interesting textures, some really interesting treatments, and or look at what it means to attain full coverage and just be a little more judicious with their stitches to lower stitch count. You don't have to be a commercial person who's all about efficiency in order to want to lower your stitch count. You can be somebody who just wants a lighter hand on your garment, so it's not bulletproof or cardboard-like. You don't have that credit card thickness and density and stiffness in your garments, or somebody who just wants some of their time back per run, even if it was something you were doing on a lark for yourself, for a friend, because you love embroidery. But If you are here, you guys know that I like to talk to the folks who are live. So we will definitely get out to our low stitch count embroidery. But before we do that, we are going to talk to the people who are here. If you're on the replay squad, we love you guys, but feel free to fast forward to the content if you want to. But when you're live, we like to chat. All right, so we have Cindy King coming in from Texas saying, good afternoon, y'all. Good afternoon, Cindy. We have Angie coming in from Louisiana. Good afternoon. Uh, Leslie in the UK from London. Happy to have you here. Thank you for checking in. Gail from Kingsbury Crafts is saying hello to everybody and to each other. Got Doug coming in from cloudy Los Angeles. Thank you, Doug, for showing up. Got Diane coming in from Connecticut. Got lots of folks jumping in, talking to each other, which I love. Cindy saying hi. Hi, Cindy, directly to me. Appreciate it. We have Frank from over in the UK. Awesome promoter of all things embroidery. Thank you for showing up today, sir. And thank you for being here and supporting everybody in this. Robbie saying hi to everybody watching from Vegas. I'm going to assume that is Las Vegas, Nevada. And not our Las Vegas, here in New Mexico, where I am currently stationed. Susan Williams coming in saying hello, everybody. We have Andre coming in from Romania. Thank you for being here. Absolutely. Ron saying hi from sunny, windy Milk River. So that's awesome. And Catskill Embroidery coming in from New York. Thank you for being here. Glad to see you here. And like I said, this may be kind of a short, maybe a content light show. So if you're desperate for something more, by all means, jump back into the back catalog over on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and check my channel there. If you're currently listening on Facebook, the place of record to get to me, to get to everything, absolutely would be on YouTube. So search up my name on YouTube, where I'll provide a link later. That's where the old school stuff is going to be. That's where the large back catalog is. Facebook is starting to delete our old videos, our old lives about 60 days out. If you want the full picture, the only way to get that is over on YouTube. So check me out there. However, let's go ahead and get into this. So low stitch count embroidery revisited, right? Unfortunately, I had a crash for this. I will try and open some files, but I won't be able to open all my files, but I do have my images loaded and ready to go so we can have some discussion about this stuff. I will say hi to other folks as they jump in, because we have some more Irene's showing up. Thank you for being here from Wisconsin. We have Barb from Minnesota Custom Made showing up. Love that too. Love to see everybody talking to each other. But the thing we're really going to get into today is low stitch count embroidery. And I'm going to jump into that by just bringing up a quick look at some different examples that I've got here, just to explain some things. And we'll talk about some stories about them and how they're put together. But at first, I'm just going to scroll through and say, here are just some various and sundry examples of low stitch count embroidery that kind of came to me. And we had an earlier version of this, so I added some more stuff to an existing version of this that we were actually sharing on a previous episode. And I thought about, what it is it that really defines low stitch count embroidery? And certainly we talk about low stitch count in general, where we're not doing full coverage. But the other thing that I often think of are the effects that we can get out of thread that aren't related to super high concentration, high density, full coverage of the background material. So looking at this, I'm seeing pieces that I have from my Paisley Falcon that I did years ago in testing some great metallic threads. And those pieces have lots of motif stitching. Yes, there's some satin stitches, some multi-pass stitches, some faux chain, and some custom motifs. We've got stuff that I did back when I was testing Q104, some stuff that you might also know as puff stuff out in the world today, which was a dense kind of mat of water-soluble material. It's like a thick felt almost that washes out entirely and leaves you with these nice thick pieces. But I did these contour light pieces. We have both in this, and you can see it kind of better in this coordinated set where we have the t-shirt and a bag that goes with it, with this lotus design that's made out of contour stitching. We've got this piece for Q104 also here that has the Art Deco design in the background. We've got some wonderful reverse applique that I did. In this case, it was a hand cut, rough cut reverse applique done as an initial strike off sample. We have pieces that were done in multicolor that became single color. So part of the stitch count is just literally going with single color design instead of full multicolor design and tearing out loads of fill. Honestly, that's sometimes the issue. We have my original light low stitch USA Trapunto design. You're going to see the updated version of that in a second. We've got a rough cut applique piece I did for Nob Hill Bar and Grill. We have some patches. There are some submissions from some people who I have worked with before and who are friends of mine that I used for magazine articles like this, which is some rip away applique where we're using heat transfer materials to fill in areas. I've got some examples of using light mesh fill, also very similar to what we have now in Embrilliance as the bidirectional knockdown, which is kind of developed kind of based on my light mesh fill technique. We have applique done on left chest. We also have designs that were redesigned and reworked to use low stitch count treatments in order to get uh, past issues that we had with production time. I've got applique being replaced that is textured so that it actually has some visual representation of texture and design in it without having to require additional stitching. We have sublimated applique and patches. And then we have the use of different kinds of underlay that can help with things. That can lift things up, that can cover up background materials. And furthermore, we've got some patches that are woven patches that are then applied to garments with an embroidered edge. And the replacement, as we can see with some of these other samples here with this Duke City that I'm kind of circling, and the original that they sent me down here, the replacement of mass amounts of fill stitch with 50% fill over applique. There's lots of ways we can come about this thing, right? So we're looking at all these different treatments. And the thing that really kind of brings them together for me is, like I said, discussing what coverage means and what we are trying to achieve and how we can lower coverage while still having a look that is appreciated and certainly while doing things that are creative. So we're going to kind of go through some of these examples and I'll explain to you, what I was thinking, what I was doing. And here's that updated USA Trapunto, which you can go grab on the Embrilliance website, by the way, if you want to run this by yourself. And the thing is, altogether, what is probably worth considering in all of these, what is a through line that puts all of these samples together, and certainly we're going to talk about them in more detail on a just individual level. The through line for all of this for me is reducing top stitching, questioning our density and coverage levels, and making sure that we structurally use both materials and our underlay styles, our digitizing styles to enhance coverage. With also in that design portion, not just the concept of creating different textures, things like that. We also, not only are we creating different textures, we're also doing things like using negative space and using the garment itself as part of that focal point, including things like the texture of the material, the color of the material, and prints that can be used so multimedia can go into that. So, really, this is all about what do we do with coverage? How much are we trying to block what's behind? And how do we artistically use what thread can do to both enhance loose coverage items, or can we go about this either in a way of justifying this through design or selecting a style that makes sense to reduce that overall amount of stitching, reduce that coverage while having, like I said, a design that looks good for you and with the materials that are involved. So I'm just going to kind of go through these pieces. We're going to talk about some of those things, and I think it'll be worthwhile to cover. So that's why I wanted to kind of revisit it and discuss it. I've got some examples in there that are like commercial things, like commercial patches off of a blister pack in a store. I've got lots of examples that are from my own work. I've got some examples that are from other digitizers that we know and love, who are friends of mine. And we'll just kind of talk about each of those pieces a little bit. We'll keep this pretty light, pretty short. And I want this to be inspirational, right? But if you do have questions, right? If you've got something that you want to talk about in this realm, if you have a question, if you have things that you would like to ask or discuss surrounding the pieces that you're seeing or what I've said, by all means, jump in and ask. So I'm happy to have you guys derail me here. This is really kind of a topic that I want it to be discussional, inspirational. We can get into some technical portions of this, but a lot of this is going to be just inspiring you to look at how you're using stitches, how you are representing surfaces, how you're getting texture, and how you're covering the space, making marks with thread as you make embroidery. So we got a couple of folks who are commenting that I want to bring in really briefly before I get in there. We do have Sandra coming in from Albuquerque. Same. Also in Albuquerque native here. Clarita coming in saying, hello, got sidetracked, but I'm here. Thank you for being here, Clarita. And Lisa Shaw, my compatriot, who has also been making some awesome work that I definitely want to share soon. So whenever she's ready to share with you her latest samples, I'll show you some cool stuff too, because I will absolutely repost some stuff from Lisa, because she, like me, really does like to use thread and the texture of thread to make things work out. And Zura, thank you for being here as well. Hi. All right, so let's talk about it a little bit. So one of the ones that I bring up a lot, and I'm going to go ahead and put this forward here as well as soon as we get started, is that USA Trapunto design that I showed you earlier. Now, Trapunto, if you don't know what Trapunto is, and I will go ahead and make myself a little banner just so you know this term. Traditionally, Trapunto is not what we think of it now, right? So Trapunto work is something that traditionally was stuffed from the back of the embroidery. So you would literally have two layers of material, and the Trapunto work was generally, and this is from my experience, not like looking at a dictionary definition. The old school version of this was that you would pack material between the two layers of embroidered material that you had. You would have something stitched through, and you would pack that, very much kind of like stump work and stuff like that in the hand embroidery world. That was the traditional Trapunto. But when you see somebody discussing Trapunto designs now, usually they're doing something, they'll even call it like embossed or debossed designs. They're usually knocking down a high pile, like something that's on a toweling or terry or sherpa, and they're knocking down some area with stitches and using the revealed area inside as texture and for height. The other thing that people can do, and it's like quilting is very similar. The other thing you'll see people call Trapunto, though, is what I've done here, which is using a material that has some loft to it or a batting, and then smashing down with embroidery the areas that we don't want to be proud of the design, so to stick up. And then using that stitching, both the stitching itself, the stitching can be the same color as the material and won't fade away, and it's really all about the negative space. Or if you're doing a piece like I did for this USA Trapunto design, both my original and the new one, in that case, it's really about using both the color and the style of the stitching and the negative space that sticks up and is kind of embossed, or you're either debossing the area you stitched or kind of embossing the negative area, and you just think about it that way. But that's kind of what we're talking about when we say Trapunto. It's not the traditional kind, but it is what we're kind of working from. So, and I will, if you guys want it, I will give you the link to this when we talk about it. I have talked about this design many times, but the story is kind of interesting as far as how I came about doing this piece and why it was important to me, and why you would even consider doing work like this in a commercial fashion. Because I know some people will look at me and say, hey, none of this is commercial logo work. We will talk about some commercial logo work in a minute, the kind of stuff that I did thousands and thousands of during my career. But we are going to talk about this piece and why it was, at least in the kind of resort wear retail design space, something that you might want to do. And you'll see really light, low coverage stitching in retail spaces, also very much in home decor. Very few stitches used to make the most impact. Honestly, a lot of it probably for cost. But let's talk about that briefly, and we'll just kind of bring that stuff to the forefront and maybe discuss very briefly why I did what I did and how it turned out. So this is the very original piece, and this was done in my oldest software. If you ever hear me moan about my old software, it did not draw curves. It only drew straight lines. It was in DOS. I believe it had 16 colors, maybe 256 color max that it could show. And it was absolutely not made for all the wonderful things that you can do today. Right. So these are kind of the two images. Here's the original piece, and we'll see if we can kind of just show it to you, and I'll zoom in. You'll see that we've outlined this area with this scribble stitching. And the thing is, everybody always asks me what this stitch type is. This is not a stitch type that is done with a fill, though you could mess around and try and make this work with a fill. This was done manually with a double running stitch. And like I said, in my oldest software running on DOS, on the resolution of the thing couldn't be much more than a Game Boy. I don't know. It was on the oldest software I've ever touched. So you can make this in any software because it really is just me pre-planning. The interesting things about this are the fact that I did indeed pre-plan the amount of density I have here. I know what this density is. I actually, despite the fact that this is not a fill and it's not a density setting, the density is pre-planned because I knew how much coverage I would get out of these doubled rows of running or straight stitch. and about how close they will be together, despite the fact that they were intentionally rough and scribbly. But the reason we did this piece was honestly entirely commercial. We had people who wanted patriotic gear, and we had a bunch of dead stock of these gray sports gray sweatshirts. And so we were pitching into essentially drugstores, so think Walgreens, and you are very, very close to the mark. We were pitching patriotic gear with light stitch counts to the Walgreens, and we wanted to make quite a lot of money on these if we could, and try and make it work out where we could get these dead stock sweatshirts into their stores very quickly in order to meet a tight time deadline. And we were trying to do it very cheaply. So what you're going to see here is that we've got over 8 inches of width on this piece, and we have a really nice amount of coverage on a center chest with under 8,000 stitches. So in this original piece had very light stitching. In this case, I think it was a little too light. There are areas that are too light. Over here on the right-hand side of the piece, you can see that it doesn't knock down quite as much as I would like it to. It does not smash flat in the Trapunto style, because I really went a little too rough and not quite as complete on the right-hand side, if you ask me. But you can see that the extraordinary loft of the sweatshirt, the open areas, allows the sweatshirt to puff up. And this really lofty sweatshirt looks very much embossed. And then if we back up here, we're going to go down to the newer version of this piece. And like I said, I'll send you the freebie version of this in a second that you can pull up. This is what the actual design looks like. This was done in Brilliance. One of the things you'll see, which does increase the stitch count, is I used a textured back stitch around the letters to make it really kind of a little more isolated and a little bolder. And you're going to see there's a little more coverage as far as the scribble stitch in the background. And with that, there's a little better embossing. And I think overall just a nicer tone to it. More regular, more professional, a little less scribbly. But even in this case, none of this is done with a fill stitch. This is done with me literally scribbling back and forth with a great deal of forethought, by the by, with a straight stitch or running stitch tool. So this is the piece that you're looking at, that Trapunto piece. But once again, this is a completely commercial event originally. The thing that made me want to do this piece, the thing that started this off, was the concept of getting something run quickly and having a lot of visual impact with a lot of stitching. How did we achieve that? Well, we're using the things that we have in front of us. We're using the abilities that we get out of that particular piece, right? If we're looking at this piece, what are the things that we're actually achieving with not too many stitches? Well, we're getting texture out of it. So we actually are having the raised nature of the design. We're also getting the texture of the scribble. It does have its own kind of edge quality that's a little rough, but it looks rustic, and it's intentional to the design. This is rustic Americana. That is what we're looking for. It is something that goes with the theme. So, but we're getting some wonderful texture. We do have the effect of line. The unevenness of the lines makes some visual interest in the piece. It doesn't look like something that's just knocked out of a big block of fill. It has some jitter to it and some character based on the fact that the lines aren't even. And once again, we are using, pardon me, we are using our negative space. Sorry, a little cough going there. We're using our negative space in a way that not only is the negative space interesting graphically, as the light gray is kind of peeking out of the red, white, and blue that is kind of diffuse in this background, but the negative space is also giving us additional texture by popping up through that piece, because let me back up and show you that tight shot of this piece, that by popping up through it and allowing the loft of the sweatshirt, or when I have a sweatshirt material that's not thick enough, I will sometimes put a very thin piece of batting behind a piece like this. So I will make a sandwich of sweatshirt, batting, and then a light cutaway if I can, and let that be a permanent piece in there. A soft cutaway is a lovely thing to have behind these, so you can really smash that together. You get that sandwich of materials, and we get all of this with very, very low stitch count. And in fact, when we're talking about this particular type of piece, there are also applied materials if we use like a small piece of batting, but that applied material doesn't really have to be treated aside from cutting the excess away, which we would do with a cutaway backing anyway. So this particular piece really kind of hits that kind of sweet spot for low stitch count embroidery, where we're using few stitches, so there's not a lot of machine time. Any materials we are adding to it don't require extra cutting because this piece does not have to be pre-cut. It can be cut with the cutaway stabilizer, which is something we would have done anyway. And we're getting a lot of texture that's almost free. Like the nature of the material of the garment we selected and of the design gives us this texture for free. And the great thing about pieces like this also, especially because it is made out of um, normal running or straight stitch, this piece is something that can be done with any level digitizing software. If you're in the embroidery or the embrilliance world, you only need Stitch Artist 1 to make this. You don't need anything else but that to get a straight stitch piece done. If you need custom motifs or anything else, then we're going further up or other stitch types. But if you're trying to do a very simple knocked piece like this, where we're debossing something or embossing, whichever word you want to use for that, you can do that very simply. Can you do this with fill stitches and such? Absolutely, you can. I find the irregularity of using these types of running stitch treatments and the thicker lines that are spaced a little further apart, I find that to be a better look for me. The thing is, we don't have to have that irregularity to get that kind of visual interest. It's absolutely not necessary to do. It's just something you can do. And like I said, that's one of those times where really it was defined by the need for this quick running, low cost design. So we did have other design style. I am lucky that I could make a justification for that with the theme, with that kind of rustic Americana theme. At the same time, it does really start from the restriction you put on yourself, which is I need to get this done in such a way that it's going to run quickly and be inexpensive for us to produce. So that's one of those reasons we kind of work from that. And the thing is, one of my other pieces that's kind of well known for something similar also has that same kind of designation. And I'm hoping I can find more of my sample stuff. Like I said, I had a big crash. I had a crash with my graphics driver right before we started, panicked out and had to be updated. But here's hoping I may grab some other samples of stuff, but I will show you some stitch samples. I was hoping to show you the original art for this piece, but I may or may not be able to get it. But there's a piece that I did for the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta that is very similar and born out of the same kind of constraints. So I'm hoping I can grab some of that stuff. But I think what I'll do is just go ahead and start by showing you the stitching. Unfortunately, this is one of those ones where I made a sample that didn't turn out as good as the actual piece that went out because of a selection that I made. And I'm actually going to use this as a caveat. The background material that you're using for this, the colors that you're using are very, very important when you have open work, because whenever we have open work, we know that open work is going to show what is behind it, meaning that if there's any sort of kind of undesirable texture or quality about your actual piece, that undesirable texture, that undesirable quality will come out to the front and will start to interfere with the look of your work. So I will bring this up. This is the original piece. And unfortunately, like I said, the denim is what's causing some of the problems with this. This is another one where we had this piece and the lightness in the denim is not what was on the original. The piece that was originally done actually had a full kind of navy blue, dark navy blue jacket back design. And I'm hoping, like I said, that I can try and bring back up one of the designs that I did for this that has the preview. Otherwise, if I can't, we'll just work with this and I'll try and show it to you. Like I said, that crash could not have come at a worse time right before the design started, but I think I may have a test image I can bring up for you. There we go. Much better. I will bring over the test image. Let me go ahead and get myself out of the way, and we'll try and grab that test image for you real quick so we can show you what the actual piece looked like from a digital preview. And I'll go ahead and bring that up so you can see it real quick. This piece, and much better. This is what the actual piece looked a lot more like, right? So we're getting a little kind of moire pattern that you're seeing just as, happens in the digital preview. But this is what the piece actually looked like on the dark background. And once again, this one was born out of extreme necessity, because the thing is, the designs that we usually do for Balloon Fiesta, the background elements that are on this thing, it's usually a big jacket back, and they're often fully covered. They're usually quite expensive to be made. They're produced overseas. However, during this year when this happened, we ended up and they go on Columbia jackets, which are very expensive. Sorry about that, guys. We're going to back off out of that element here for a second. Now you can see the actual piece again. When this occurred, when we had the issue with this particular design, the people who are supposed to be producing this design flaked out, and they said they were no longer going to be able to provide the jackets in time. So we ended up with these jackets that were given to us locally. They had to be run locally. So we're now in US production. We're no longer producing overseas. And these things have to get done very quickly. They have to get done with not only haste, but with good cost as far as the pieces that we're working on. They have to be done very, very quickly, cheaply, and they have to have massive coverage. So we're talking about full jacket back coverage. And unfortunately, that does mean that in trying to create that, we really can't do the kind of stuff we would usually do. We're not going to be able to create full applique pieces necessarily, because we can't afford to stop and do the cutting and all that. We're not going to be able to create fully embroidered, full coverage pieces for these pilots' jackets. They're going to have a lighter coverage. They're going to have to stitch very quickly because we have limited time and limited budget. So what I decided to do in this case is we made excellent use of contours. So I had already done pieces using contour stitching, because contour stitching, as you can see, especially on this zoomed out view, and if I adjusted the colors, you might get a better look at it. This particular piece with that zoomed out view, you'll see how we get this density of color toward the bottom of the balloon, but we have a looseness or a darkness here in the center. So we have these little highlights and this dark, the deeper areas of color at the top and bottom, and these looser areas where these individual panels, these columns, get wider. That is a natural function of this type of stitch. This is a contour stitch. If you're an embrilliance or stitch artist, it's a contour 1, and you actually have to look because contour 1 and contour 2 act differently. The thing is, the way this works, the density setting does not stay solid along the entire width of any given column. Whatever space that you have to fill, whether that's a narrow area or a wide area, it's going to fill with the same number of stitch lines. So as this goes, when it gets narrower, it'll be denser. When it gets looser or more open, it will be more open and less dense. That means that the shape of the piece is actually defining the density. But the funny thing about that is, even though with a darker color, you actually would get highlights probably in the right space, in this case, the concept was just like a balloon glow. You know that hot air balloons are filled with hot air through a flame that's at the bottom. And you can see we rendered that flame as a metallic flame inside the balloon underneath the stitching. We'll have the area right around the neck of the balloon is actually the brightest, and then where the light is at the top is bright as well. And so in this case, we like the idea of this being a starry kind of night scene with these swirly clouds behind it that are just barely visible. And then we have the glowing area right around the neck of the balloon here where the fire is, and at the top edge. It actually fits really well with the original design. Now, that's not how the design originally looked. This is something I put together based on the theme, and the theme did not have any of this in it. The use of the contour stitching, the use of that glowing element, and the addition of the metallic flame, which sparkles when it's in, when you're actually sitting there with it. Those are all part of the kind of artistic portion of it, part of what, we really had to add to make this thing more interesting. And I think that's really where it kind of, to me, was interesting as just a technical thing to understand, is that the embroidery and the stitch's nature, even the nature of the stitch as digitized, gave us that by itself. It's just something that is it's a byproduct of the way that stitch is filled in software, and that's multiple types of software. It doesn't necessarily matter what software you're in. Usually that contour column is, especially contour 1 type, is going to create that same kind of look. And one of the first place where I really saw it, where I used it, was actually in this piece for FDNY. Right after 9/11, the company that I was with did the official licensed work for FDNY and NYPD. And unfortunately, this is a piece that never went to full production, so all I have are my samples. But this was one of the original samples of applique for them. And once again, the way you're looking at this piece is very similar. The flames that are in this piece are done with really simple contour stitching, and that contour stitching is all in one color. So what you're seeing here is one color of thread and one color of applique, and it is just in the spacing and the use of layering and of the reveal, how much thread is there in each of those layers of density that are creating that visual interest in this piece in the FDNY applique. So very similarly, that piece, and then if we go back up to the balloon pieces, it really does kind of show you that same light effect, that same kind of glow effect. It is the overlapping of those pieces. It is how close together they are, and it's really born entirely out of the way that contour stitching works in software. And to that point, we can actually show that to you very quickly. And I think I will go ahead and do that. Is just show you contour stitching in software, just to kind of give you the concept of how it looks. And we can do this. We're in Stitch Artist, obviously, as I show you this, but this really is just the nature of contour stitching. If we look at this object as it is, it really is just about how close together items are. So here we have a 4-point density contour. We've got 2 layers of contour stitching together to make these flames. If we want to look at the actual shapes, they are just simple satin stitch shapes. So we can see that though we do get some change as far as using stitch angles will kind of change generation. Really, the primary point of difference for that light and darkness is just how close together the edges are on the contour stitching. So one of the things to kind of think about with this is just to understand that we have these tools in front of us that are going to create different textures depending on how we use them. In the case of contour stitching, I go back and forth with this all the time because it has this really lovely ability to create varying densities along a curved path. And we can create some really interesting effects and interesting levels of density that as you zip, as we said earlier, in fact, Clarita says this, you can see the light dark better when you back away from it. It's trippy. And it's also in real life, it looks a little more obvious or apparent, but as we look at this piece, you really do see that it's a very simple to get those kinds of effects. And also, if we go back to my samples here, you can see that I use it extensively for that same reason. If we go to any of these pieces that have this kind of look, and this one, by the way, you'll see that there's some extra texture here. This was done with entirely water-soluble stabilizers, including the stabilizer for the entire design. And when you wash that away, it does create some looseness in the stitching. I was not particularly concerned with that because this is supposed to be distressed. The cool thing about this is a t-shirt that only has thread making up the design. So all of this texture that we're getting, all of that is because we're using wash away applied materials. And the height of this is just thread. So there's no dense materials in it. In fact, there's no stabilizer in it whatsoever. So the looseness and loopiness of that background contour never really bothered me much because that was part and parcel of the piece. The funny thing is you can see if we go to this bag here where we have a canvas bag that's a little more stout, it held those stitches in a different way, certainly than the t-shirt did. The light natural t-shirt that we were using didn't quite hold the stitches in the same fashion. But once again, that's the applied material. So we're using that applied material. In this case, we had a water-soluble like felt layer that allowed this top layer of stitches, which was all that was sewn on top of it, to remain proud of the surface once it was washed away, and doesn't have additional stitching under it aside from a normal underlay. It does have a slightly heavier underlay with zigzags involved, but it is not super heavy the way that like a 3D foam would be, though that's another way to get texture, though that's definitely not a stitch conscious friendly way to do it. If the distress is tolerable to your client, if the use of negative space and seeing the background element of your material is tolerable to your client, you can do a lot by using line to define spaces, using contours to get those kinds of effects. So it really can be interesting, and it can create depth and movement, which actually Lisa just said, and I'll go ahead and bring her up into that too. Yeah, contours can create movement and depth. Love it. Yeah, me too. I really do like contours for that. And frankly, you'll see me using them a lot because they do kind of give you that that free depth. Whereas fill stitches, and there's nothing wrong with using light fills. In this case, this particular piece I did for Knob Hill Bar and Grill, we are combining the use of applied materials in this background because it's a rough cut applique jersey knit on top of another piece of jersey, so still very light, very supple. We're using that plus motif stitching plus multi-pass satins, so multi-pass or whip stitch satin stitches for the NH itself to reduce the amount of overall stitching, but still get some interesting texture. And you can see that actually the densities do differ between the different colors because how much of that material, that color and coverage I wanted changes. The gray over gray, I just want a hint of it because I've got this nice dark gray material or dark gray stitching over this material. Whereas the contrast between the lighter gray and this dark maroon, you really want to see a little bit more of that maroon. But once again, we have to think about it very much like Clarita says, you might see something better when you step away from it. The viewing distance is also a thing. This is on the hip of someone who is acting as a server in this bar and grill. Yes, you will see it fairly close, and I do need to look decent from a close up, but a little bit of distance is not going to make it bad. In fact, it's going to blend those colors and make it even more, more approachable. This piece is only about 4 inches tall, so this is really not going to be. It's not massive, and you aren't going to be looking at it at the magnification that I'm showing you here. Like this is not the view of the piece you're going to see. We can look at it for the interest of seeing how it's put together, but you are not going to see it zoomed in like this. You're going to see it on someone's hip from a little bit of distance. So that's part of the thing to think about with coverage as well, is really is that coverage necessary to the look? And in this case, that's interesting, but I would say it's a little less dynamic than some of the stuff we were seeing with the contours, as you see in the Lotus background here. And certainly if we go back again to the balloon Fiesta design, as we see in the balloon here, the light and dark, or especially as we get from the kind of winding and sinuous curves in the flames here on the FDNY applique. So all interesting ways to go about getting texture here. So it's kind of the thing, like what are we getting out of this? We are getting different types of texture. We are getting, like I said, we're getting the play of the line. We're getting some movement and some motion by following that curvature in the lines. So yeah, texture. We're seeing some openness. We're also playing with the texture of the garment underneath, something I'm going to show again in a moment. We're seeing line values, so both thickness and thinness of lines. The sketch lines were thicker. Some of these contour lines are very thin. They're single passes of straight stitch or running stitch in a contour, as generated by a contour column in our software. But the lines are sinuous and curving and overlap, and they create patterns and interference patterns, as you saw in the FDNY sample. We are using applied materials. So appliques applied materials both add texture and color, and they can add even more than that if we use prints, which we're going to talk about. Negative space. We are using negative areas both to increase texture with the embossing or to allow the background or the material to do some of that work to give us some of the visual interest. And certainly all of that's creating lots of like contrast for us. It's giving us visual interest and motion and contrast, and it's a way to use fewer stitches and still get a lot of coverage area for the entire design area without having full coverage, full stacked up depth and density in our individual blocks of stitches. So interesting stuff there. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple more examples of stuff like that, and then we'll probably transition from that into some more commercial stuff too. Like I said, I want to walk you through a couple more things and say, hey, here are some things just to look at, to be interested by and see that they are interesting as far as low stitch counts. And then we'll do some of that commercial stuff and discuss where there were some areas where I used these different elements to make commercial designs work better and be more efficient. But yeah, I think, like I said, it's something that I want to be inspirational to you, where you stop and say, hey, maybe I'm smashing a lot of fill stitch on everything and solid satin stitches. I'm not thinking about what I could do, what is possible. I'm not thinking about making marks in other ways aside from just, here's my art. The art's fully colored in this area. I'm going to make sure I fully cover it. And I'm going to just use, stitches in a standard way to do it. And we'll get to some more of that with commercial stuff as well. But I just think it's worthwhile thinking about. And honestly, you can get inspiration from anywhere. And to kind of put that to the point, I'm just going to show you like a few weird little designs I picked up off the rack from a patch or applique station in a commercial store, just a regular retail store, because I thought it was interesting just to say, hey, here are some little patches, and they're just using this stuff to kind of good ends, despite the fact that they're little mass produced patches. So I thought, why not? We'll show you these images too. Little Adventure USA, are they perfect? No. Are we seeing some problems with these? Absolutely. Is the stitching as clear as it should be? That's up for debate. But what can we see here? We are using an applied material here, in this case, kind of a faux chenille look, or really a piece of kind of chenilled material. Applied, we've got a nice satin border on it, we've got satin text on it. We are using some contrast between the satin stitch details on this mountain and the fill behind it, this vertical fill. Text could be a little cleaner, sure, but we have texture, we have interest, and this thing is probably not too many stitches aside from probably this fill. And even then, I would wager we're using some nice fuzzy threads because we've got some stuff that's not super shiny in that background black. So interesting stuff we can do. Thick threads, by the way, another way we can reduce stitch count. If we tune our machine for thicker threads and run thicker threads, we can get coverage even if we don't use the same number of stitches. So we can actually reduce time, despite the fact that thick threads, depending on which ones, can be a little harder to manage. This little guy, once again, are there troubles here? Absolutely. I'm seeing troubles. But if we zoom out, that star looks pretty good. We zoom in close. Look at how little coverage we have in that metallic star. It doesn't even really have a lot of underlay to mitigate it. If I were going to do this piece myself, I would have more edge underlay. I would have some zigzags on that piece to cover more. I would actually have more coverage on this piece to try and make it look a little bit more solid. But you can see, look at this. Also, this silver in the background, that's not stitching. That is the background material, and the material itself is textured. So it has some sort of texture pressed into it, I believe, because it's like a film. And they've also done a straight cut on the outside. Luckily, this is something that doesn't ravel. But look at this. We've got some applied materials with the sequins. We've got regular light density fills. Also, look, we've got some shine through those fills. It is not fully covered, but when we zoom out from this piece, fairly acceptable. I would say the lettering needs some help, needs a little 911 attention. But at the same time, looking at this very cheaply made piece, we still get some inspiration out of it. Also, another piece from that same collection. What are we doing again? We've got that textured background material. And pardon me while I grab a drink here. This textured background material, it does some heavy lifting, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's something fantastic all the time. And honestly, do I see issues with all of this stuff? Yeah, the text absolutely needs to be cleaned up. We need to deal with some of this background, like this whole closing up. We need to open up this A. We need to do some compensation work. The little stars down here are overdone. They could actually be less stitching by using a very classic, kindergarten drawing star done double would probably do better at that size. So there's stuff to work on here, but looking at this, what do we have? We have a contrast between stuff that's shiny and not. We are only using 2 colors of thread. We have a modicum of stitches. The fill is fairly light here. I guess we have 3 colors, and we got the red border that's here too. Should we open this up a little bit? Absolutely. And in fact, we use less stitches, but that fill having a little bit of shake to it, not a bunch of underlay, is not killing the look of this piece, and it's doing the job that it's doing. So yeah, a glittery, Clarita says it looks like a glitter canvas. Yeah, very likely it's some sort of pressed glitter material. I really didn't get close in on it, but it was something that didn't ravel, so it looked more like a film when I got close to it. Cindy says, of course, I love that it's a Texas thing. Yeah, we had a literal Texas thing. Yeah, for sure. But you could certainly do a better job of this technically, but there were people buying these, right? There were people buying these off the rack, and that's fine. Like I said, it's not something that necessarily they don't always have to be perfect. And this little North Peak Expedition one is great too. I think that use of the contrast between something fuzzy and loose and something a little tighter, a little shinier is always nice. And it's not perfect, but it does the job pretty well. And it's interesting to see because that without this background fill being stitched, and especially if this was a design and not a patch design, the edge border could be much lesser and much less dense. You could have a pretty low stitch count design and really get a lot of work out of it, so it's kind of interesting for that. So, Clarita says, oh my God, I just went to the museum a few weekends ago and took pictures of all the space patches. I want to go through them and learn more about the way patches are made. 100%. If you haven't seen my episode about analyzing embroidery, instead of just analyzing designs, like looking at embroidery and making a kind of a tight analysis of how it's put together so you can reproduce things, by all means, go out back and check that. What I always say is I call it retail research. You would not believe all of the stares I've had because I take pictures of everything, and I do mean everything embroidered, which means that I have taken pictures of some pairs of, let's say, unmentionables that I probably shouldn't have taken pictures of. But with the embroidery is good enough, I will take pictures of anything. And yes, I do mean anything. So yeah, I understand that sometimes you shouldn't, but I generally tend to, and that means both the front of the embroidery and the back of the embroidery. And yes, pretty much every time I go to a store. But that's how you get inspired. You look at what's going on, you identify the way things are put together, and then you take the technique and add the technique to something that you would like to do. You put those things together. That mashup can be something new. You have a design that's uniquely yours, and you mash up different techniques from other places, and it's always worthwhile. You always have to look. You always have to take notice of what's going on there. And like I said, you'll never know where there's something that could be commercially viable where you might not think it was. And let's see if I can show you a couple of commercial examples to kind of close this out, because I'd like to probably do this in an hour today instead of an hour and a half. I am going to go over briefly some commercial examples of reducing stitch count. I do have a couple comments I want to grab. First thing, and I forgot to put this out earlier, and I see that Lisa did put this out. If you wanted, and I'll put it back on screen so you can see it, and then we'll discuss really quickly. If you guys want that USA design, if you got interested in doing that Trapunto style design, and let's go ahead and bring that back up on screen. Lisa certainly shared the link in the chat already if you want it. This is the post you will go to. And if you are not already somebody who runs Embrilliant software at all, don't worry. You don't have to have paid Embrilliant software to get this out. If you get down to the bottom, number one, there's some great process pics here that show you kind of how this thing looks while it's running, kind of proof of that embossing as it gets done. When you go down here, there's a button to download this file. Right below the button is a description of how you can use that file to get out a machine file for yourself if you want that piece. So if you have other software and you want to try this out and you haven't bought anything from Embrilliant yet, that's fine. Use the free express version as described in the bottom of that page, and you can get that for yourself and save it out to any machine file you are likely to use. So if you're using DSTs, maybe not some arcane transfer formats, but if you're using anything else, and especially because almost every machine will take a DST, you can go and output a DST file of this piece and use that at your leisure. Also, though I will say it's going to change the density of the piece, it means you can also resize it. I've seen people using this thing from everything from cap size logos out to full size jacket backs. Plus, like I always say, it was meant for 40-weight thread, but if you use thicker thread, you could go much larger with this piece and get a very similar look. It depends on the factor of the thickness of the thread. So if you want to try that out, go ahead and grab that. Thank you, Lisa, for putting that in as a clickable link before I got to it. I was going to paste it in there, I swear, but I do appreciate you putting that in there for me. And we also have another comment here that I want to bring up real quick. Clarita says, I saw a card decal that made me want to make a design today. Not exactly what I saw, but I'm going to try it soon. Absolutely. I've got a piece that I'm looking at right now, and I get the same kind of instances, right? I've seen a couple of pieces I want to work on. There's a piece that Lisa did recently that she hasn't shown anybody yet, so you don't know, and I can't tell you. But she did a cool piece that makes me want to do some experimentation with some techniques, and I won't even talk about it yet since she hasn't shared it yet. But there'll be something that I'll be doing another show on later, I'm sure. I've already done a show on something similar. So some cool techniques using stitch types that are maybe not the standard you're used to. And I recently saw a piece of art that my wife showed me. She just today had her final day of medical school. So cheers to my wife. You guys know that's why we're moving, because I've talked about it before. But she had some cool alumni gear that they put together where they didn't do versions that she could use, but she really liked some of the art. And the art style was cool. So I may or may not be making some myself to work that out for her. We'll have to see. I might be getting hired back into the job of being the embroiderer for a minute and actually not just doing this for education and for you folks, but for making some alumni gear for my UNMH, UNM medical school grad over here. So yeah, and by the way, congratulations, Celeste. Yes. Thank you, Lisa. I'll tell her. I'll tell her. She's not watching, but I'll tell her anyway. She's not an embroidery person. I am. But hey, anyway. So we'll have to take a look folks. Like I said, it's worthwhile to see what's out there. I think all of us should take inspiration from the stuff that's out there and around. But let me go over just a few of the commercial samples here and explain some low stitch count stuff. The thing I will say though is, first and foremost, the one thing you can do, and I know you've heard it from me before, there's whole episodes where I've talked about this very thing, but I'm just going to bring it up one more time and just absolutely hammer this into the ground. If you want to be more efficient with your embroidery, you should be doing swatch testing. So, what is swatch testing? I know you've heard it from me before, but if you're not doing it yet, let this be your reminder to go out there and do it. Swatch testing is where we take an embroidery stitch or a design style or even a combination of stitches we want to see an interaction behind and make small swatches and change variables in each swatch to get where we want to get with the look. And it lets us do small amounts of testing on elemental, essential parts of embroidery so that when we go to design, we can make changes and apply them. So once again, I know you've seen me talk about this before, but we're just going to hammer this one right into the ground permanently. This is a swatch test. This is polyester thread, 40 weight thread with a 30.3 millimeter underlay that is perpendicular to the top angle. So we can see that underlay up here at the top. I started from what would be considered half density to down here on the bottom right, what would be considered full density. So 0.4 millimeters or 4 embroidery points. And I went up by increments until I got there. And here's what I'm going to tell you. When I'm looking at this piece, if I look at this bottom left-hand corner and I see this bottom left-hand corner fill, I see that as pretty darn close to full, right? If I zoom in tight on these two, yep, this one on the right is very complete and full, though it does look like it's starting to draw in a little bit and maybe do a little bit more push distortion. It's starting to try and pucker. It's a little dense. I look at this piece over here on the bottom left and say that is definitely close enough. That is hand grenades and horseshoes close enough to full coverage for me to be happy with that coverage in this color combination and contrast. So if I am, which I was, making designs in dark colors on these natural colored kind of khaki colored aprons and this twill, this level of coverage is well enough for me. If we look at this swatch, the one that's on the left-hand side versus the one that's on the right-hand side of this bottom row, the one on the left has 18% fewer stitches. So if you could get back like a fifth of your day every day, roughly, you get 18% of your day back or get 18% more runs out of your machine daily. That would be very useful to you. And it's going to feel better. And frankly, looking at this swatch test, there are instances where I think I could even put up with one more square above where a little bit of the background showing through wouldn't kill me. So if you test stuff with the relative contrast that you're going to use with the kind of fuzz and the texture you're going to use, do some swatch testing like this, you're going to naturally get better with that. Or if you're testing a thread you've never used before, in this case, I was testing, frankly, it was a spun polyester, but I'm going to tell you the truth. This test is done with some serger thread, which runs fine. I mean, it runs fast, runs fine. It's a little fuzzy because you have to clean up your machine a little bit more, but same kind of thing. I wanted to see how good does a fill stitch look? And you can see with this fuzzier thread, I'm backing up way up into the second row and I'm still seeing some pretty solid coverage with this color combination. You could use this fuzzy thread at a much lower density than you might consider full density, which is down here on the bottom right-hand corner. So like I said, swatch testing is always going to be useful. We can tell you, you can look up, and there are people who are going to give you numbers that say, this is what full coverage is, this is what it looks like. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And yes, I'm very expressly using the entire sentence for that one. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. It is not until you stitch and look at something on a fabric that you actually know what it's going to look like in embroidery. And numbers floating around on a sheet somewhere don't tell you everything. The best thing you can do for your particular usage, especially if you're designing stuff, you're learning how to digitize a technique or something else like that, you absolutely can test it for yourself and you'll see exactly how it turns out when you're using the right materials. So just a thing to remember, swatch testing and testing in general, doing stitch outs is important. when you are doing new materials, when you are doing new techniques, when you are working on a design style that you might not have done before. Sew out some swatches. You'll feel more secure in the choices that you make. And then you can also refer back to them because you might later down the road want a lighter coverage, want some show through on purpose. And you can look at a piece and go, okay, this level of density with these threads and on this material gives me about this much reveal. And now I have a palette from which to work from that all of my variables are known to me. And that's always a fantastic thing. So looking at a few more of these commercial samples, and I wanted to kind of show you real simple stuff. And the funny thing is I've gone both directions on this type of design. I'll just show you. One of the simplest ways to do low stitch count, it's just like people trying to get cheaper screen prints. It's the number of colors and coverage that causes stuff. I've gone both directions on designs like this, where either we go from a full color design like we have on the right, yank all of the fills that are out from underneath it if we have full outlining on the left, and you can go ahead and use that as a single color design, and you just dump those fills. The other thing you can do is add applique in some of these areas, and especially when we have big solid satin stitch borders like you see on this particular piece in the gold on that right hand side, you can often tack down an applique covering some element or a couple of elements of color and massively reduce your stitch count. Now, it does then require precise placement and cutting of the applique. In that case, your time might be a wash, but it might be less time specific on the machine. And if the machine time is the biggest cost for you, especially opportunity cost wise, you want to get that machine free, then it might be worthwhile for you to do that. And certainly it can save your bacon for getting some visual interest. This piece here that I did for Gilly Loco Salsa, and I don't have the entire piece here. I'll try and show you that in a moment. I used a standard applique in the central logo element that's up here in tan. And in this is the tail of a lizard. And I'm going to try and get you the other half of this. Like I said, I had a weird crash right before this. It made me lose some of my stuff I had put together. I will try and get the applique head to show you, and we'll pop that up. Here we are. And I'll just literally drag this into place. This is the head of this design. That's the entire design has this sign in the middle that he's holding. This is Gilly Loco Salsa. And there's the head and the tail. Well, if we look at that piece, we have this textured applique material. In this case, it was an upholstery material that has a serpent-like texture, a snakeskin texture on it. And that gave us a bunch of additional texture and quality to the piece on a jacket back. When it was originally filled with fill stitches as left chest, I actually blew it up to the jacket back size, did some tweaking on details in the final piece, and then used this piece with the tweaked details and used the applique to both save us a bunch of time and to get the piece some kind of visual interest in this area that would have been a giant fill in the original low kind of low detail art. The art itself didn't have a lot of detail here, but when you blow up that very simple art to this big giant jacket back, this was a much nicer look to give it some texture. And the case that made this commercially viable, these people wanted a dozen full-size jacket backs overnight, with more to follow in the next couple days for a launch party and for investors. So they wanted these pieces quickly, and they wanted really big, impactful looking jacket backs. Using applied materials made that possible and let us get a lot of visual interest out of it without having to mess around. Same kind of thing with tearaway applique, rip applique, and it actually is one of those really wonderful ways to get additional coverage. In this case, here's a piece where we have a rip away glitter flake applique used as the center of a hard hat on a dog jacket. And then I actually did something even a little more extreme. Now this one, there's additional printing that has to get done. This piece and this piece here were both done by sublimating a white glitter flake applique with a sublimation transfer before using it as a rip away. And if you don't know how rip away applique works, just very quickly, the way rip away applique works is to lay this entire piece down over a placement stitch, just like you would with traditional applique, but with the edges raw, just with the entire layer of this applique material, of this heat press material raw, and you run your satin stitches, and then you just literally tear it away from the edges. You will see, especially when you're using something with high contrast, you'll sometimes see little elements of it that are still present around the edge. Not to say that that's all that distracting, especially when you're doing something like I did with the full color. Not only do you not necessarily see it if you're very careful with your removal, but depending on the color contrast and the method by which you did the work, it might not be that galling. Like you can see a little tiny bit here at the bottom of the B and ABQ, but it doesn't really take away horribly from the design. The thing is, once you run that satin stitch, you can tear this stuff away. It's been perforated by that satin stitch edge, and then you heat press it one more time to fix it. The thing about that is this does take additional pressing. So if the time overall is the problem with your kind of efficiency, then knowing that you have to do one more round of heat pressing and the removal is one thing. But as far as applique goes, this doesn't require us to do precise pre-cutting or cutting in place. It tears away very simply. We just remove either our plain glitter or our press glitter from a carrier sheet, lay it down with a placement stitch, go ahead and do all of our edge embroidery, and then tear away that excess and press it one more time. That does make it quite a bit more efficient than other methods of doing applique. Though, I mean, certainly other applique methods are thoroughly viable. I was brought a piece, and also it was horribly distorted from the excess density. This is a piece that was done for Duke City Ready Mix. This is supposed to be a circle. It was no longer, partially from being unsupported and from having, you can see the angle of the fill stitch, which by the way had some weird texture going on in it. The angle of the fill stitch was on that 45 degree and the weak angle of that material. And the denim shirt just wrinkled up into a wad and really was not very visible as a circle once it was done. And honestly, didn't look real great. I scanned this piece and redrew it, but in order to lighten it up, because they wanted to use it on essentially athletic polo shirts, when you see this piece, if I zoom in really tight on it, you can see how this fill stitch is loose, is light. This has a simple circle, a pre-cut circle. So also, by the way, doesn't have to be positioned very carefully. It's got a nice wide satin stitch around the edge, and any orientation, because this is a true circle, it's a really great reason to use applique in this area. Any orientation that circle is going to be fine. It's got like a 50% fill coverage, and I think it's actually less than 50% on this piece. So we aren't actually covering the fill, but the customer, who was absolutely adamant that they have a fully embroidered look to this background, got that fully embroidered look, but without the excessive amount of stitching that was going to be there. So applique itself doesn't always have to be the star. It can also just be the supporter in this case. Certainly you can do more with applique than that, but it does work very well in that supporting role. Or even if they don't really care about that full fill stitch look, you can do a piece like this where one of the other benefits of using the applique, in this case, this is a twill, and it's a very patch-like look, though it does look integrated because of the satin stitch edge, the full direct satin that attaches it. We essentially did this very much like an applique, but having pre-run and cut out these circles, you can do that. And that way you don't embroider it almost at all through the base garment. If the garment is very stretchy and doesn't hold up to embroidery well, all you embroider is the tack down and this satin edge. Or I think on some of these, because these were piqué polos that hold up to it, you just tack down this like a traditional applique, and instead of having a fill in the circle where the fill, the angle of fill might interact with the small text, with the small details, instead of doing that, you lay down this really lovely flat piece of twill, and you can do incredibly fine details and really nice text on top of that twill without having to have that look. Now, certainly, the people who are ordering this have to agree to and enjoy the look of the applied material instead of a fill stitch for it, but it can be great. And it doesn't have to be excessively patch-like. If they don't like the patch-like look, having that satin stitch that covers that edge really does make it look more like an integrated embroidery. Certainly there's other ways to go about that, but I think it's a useful kind of tool to have in the in the overall toolbox for us. And I'm sorry, I'm zipping around here. I thought I had one more to show you in that case, but I don't. It's worthwhile, though, to just kind of see applique as something that can be used as a tool in that way. The other thing I will say is that there's also the possibility of multimedia. Not everybody loves multimedia for everything, but several times where I could not do, in this case, these were done for movie sets where they couldn't spend time with extra digitizing. We did fully sublimated patches in this same way, and you can do that with any kind of decoration, even direct decoration. This piece was done by Buzzards Bay Embroidery, and they did sublimated patches over 3D foam and just did a nice edge over the 3D foam. They had this raised kind of platform of art. Those things are all valuable. And so are things like using woven labels. And you can either use them with an edge and have the patch style and just attach them, or you can do, like I showed you earlier, applique style, and the smooth satin stitch border on the edge will actually integrate it uh, into the garment a little bit more and make it look more like a standard applique, and it can be a little more attractive for those folks. And just to show you a couple more pieces, once again, here's one other where we did that same patch style on a piece that was damaged. So in this case, we had a damaged logo. I will say that we're having a little bit of puckering on it, and this is a bag for, I believe this was a picnic blanket with a very thin kind of outer layer on it. So there was some previous embroidery that was done that had puckered it underneath. You can see that the puckering is only in some areas. And this was done once again in that patch slash applique style. So it looks more integrated than a standard patch, though there is still some thickness because of the applied material. And these are all viable things to do. And also, I just want to point out before I get done here, a couple of examples where even when the art calls for something, you don't necessarily have to use exactly the textures that are there. This is one piece. I designed this patch for the David Westfall Veterans Foundation Run for the Wall. And the background just had the colors of the Vietnam ribbon, but I went ahead and used satin stitches to get texture. So we had this ribbed texture that looks more like that award ribbon. The truth of the matter is, though, there is a little bit more stress on the material from this when we're working on a patch or something that has a lot of stability. These overlap satins are actually less stitch count than a fill stitch in the same area. So sometimes that can work in your favor. And the other thing I wanted to show you is that sometimes texture can also be part of that. I showed you all these textures and contours, and kind of people have said, oh, well, nobody's using that in commercial pieces. And I'm going to show you a piece where I specifically did where it does work. It just has to be thematically related, and the customer has to be on board. You have to talk to them about it. So here's a piece that I did for the National Labs, Sandia National Labs. You can see the little Thunderbird logo that's down in here. And this is for the Starry Night project. And what we can see here is they provided me with art that does not have texture, right? This is vector art. It's real simple. The colors don't have special texture in them, but I do know that they're making a reference to Van Gogh's Starry Night in this piece. And when I'm looking at this piece, I'm like, you know what? We really could do something more for them. So I'm just going to show you the digital preview. I don't have a stitch out for this one right this moment. But if you look at this digital preview, you can see we have lower stitch count, but a little bit higher density than some of the other pieces. But we're using contours. So now we are using the line value. We're using that motion of line in this case. So it's not just coverage, it's the line, it's the curvature and that motion to create some visual interest. And because we are on a patch, because we are on a very stable material, and because we're running over black, I can use really light densities inside this piece, or lighter than usual coverage and no underlay, because it's okay for this to look swirly. It's okay for it to show some negative space. So we can kind of use that. And you can also see, because we're trying to keep this light, because we have just these highlights of color and outline that are supposed to be on the garment of the observer for the stars who's using these little binoculars, we're actually using the negative space for the garment. So we're not going to stitch in the black. We're going to leave it open and use that negative space. Though we did use some texture in the hair. We did carve out the satins for the fingers and the hands because they're a focal point in the design. We had these individual satin stitches overlap for the fingers, and then the hands are satins, and the wrist and the collar are satins that will stand up in different angles. We are using the background of the flat material of the twill to describe the shirt and to allow some of that through for that starry night behind it, reducing the amount of stitches to get the kind of coverage out of the piece with both the negative space and with the looseness of density and the lightness of the coverage. So this is all stuff where you just have to say, where are my opportunities for that? They're not going to be everywhere. Don't get me wrong. Not everybody's going to let you do this stuff, but certainly where there's a big slab of color, you saw the pieces last week, when there's big slabs of color on a giant jackback piece, recommend applique and see if it fits in with the style. In the case of those papal banners I did that are on a very satiny material, having a shiny background in that is not at all undesirable. It might not be for everybody. When you have a design, and this is a design of mine, this iris, which was done for the ancestral fleur-de-lis, I'll show you two versions. This is a small pocket version that I did. You can see that I'm using curved fills here in the top. I'm using those classic contour one, and I'll very briefly show you the difference between contour one and contour two before we finish here, to create the petals and the leaves. You can use the darkness behind it on this black material to allow it to look almost like sketching or etching. And then it is part of the design. The light texture of that is part of what gives this character. And in fact, depending on how it's put together with multimedia, I'll show you the original where the first time this was used as a large piece. This was done underneath a fleur-de-lis of rhinestones, and it has little florets here as well as the main iris, which is thought to be kind of the origin of the fleur-de-lis by some folks. Once again, we are using the orange and the yellow together. The other colors, we had a black with a cooler purple, like purple irises. In this case, I'm using the orange as a medium tone, the orange of this garment, with the yellow and the looseness of the contour stitching to create depth in the florets, in the flowers. Like I said, there's lots of ways we can go about that. We can have full coverage with thick thread. That's just fewer stitches than a thinner thread. Very much like this is a piece from Joe Kramer, who I've taught with, where he did a very commercial logo, but in a very thick thread, and there's some looseness, but it still reads as a full commercial logo, including him using that negative space for outlining. It's really just about thinking about the space, thinking about how we're using thread, and thinking about how we can motivate that design with lines, with texture, with that color, and understanding that not all interest comes from smashing more thread into it from layers upon layers. We can use applied materials. We can use line value. We can use motion to create something interesting and even to create something that is commercially viable. All right, folks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let that be enough for this week. I want to do some more cool technical stuff coming soon that has some more instructional value. Hopefully today was a little inspirational for you. Just something to think about. It's not like we don't do plenty of logo stuff and full coverage and shading and gradients on top of gradients and every other thing. This stuff can be done, right? We can do shading, we can do layers upon layers, we can do borders. Go back through all of the past episodes and you'll find me talking all about layering and borders and full fills and underlay. The thing to think about is we are building this thing from thread, whatever this design is. We have underlay, we have structure, we have the directions in which they interfere with each other. We have how open or how loose our density can be. And then we have the tracking of individual stitch lines and how that creates motion and line value. There's so much we can do that does not require excessively complicated tools that can be done with the kind of the basic 4 stitches of machine embroidery, that can be done with multi-pass or whip stitch additions to standard stitch columns or satin columns. And like I said, it really does come to just thinking about how stitches are put together. The one thing I did say I would show, and I'll do it very briefly because somebody asked me about this previously. Once again, I said the difference between if you're in Stitch Artist, there is a contour 1 and contour 2. I just want you to know there's contour and contour 2. Standard contour does the cool little trick we talked about earlier with the light and the dark. Contour 2 is made to maintain one density throughout. So if you set a density, what you're going to see is it will actually add or remove lines of stitching to maintain that density. If you throw yourself on contour 2, the little fun tricks disappear, but you can get an even density if you need an even density. So last technical trick, and then we'll go ahead and leave you be. Go play with your software. Go find some embroidery to look at. Check stuff out, take some pictures, do some analysis, and try it out. Do some swatch testing. Make a design that's just for you and see how it turns out for you. I think it's worthwhile to do some testing, actually get into the thread, and if you're going to understand anything below your little jaw, as the Icelanders say, something that's not in your head, that's not from reading stuff, from listening to me, from going through tutorials, the best way to do that sometimes is just to get that needle, get that thread together, and start stitching. So try some of this stuff out. Think about the way you make marks with thread. Think about what it means to allow the background through and to allow show through on purpose, and try some stuff out. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. And even your traditional or commercial style embroidery will get better as you gain control of how you make marks and how you get that coverage. All right, folks, thank you for being here, and I can't wait to see you again next week.